When did we meet?
We met,
It was at one of the Potter's Guild shows, wasn't it?
well, actually, it was before that.
Yeah.
So Julie Devers has been a potter for, I don't know, a long time. And I used to summer here. And so we would, I'd go to the Coast Guard craft show. And you were doing that show.
It was
and
the
so,
art show.
Yes, it was
I
the art show.
never did the craft show.
And so I bought a big platter from Julie that was in her orange chino with one white line, and then it had a bowl that went with it, and then a butter dish, and I still have them. A lot of other pieces, but that's, and I bet Camille was 5 years old.
And you at the time said, I'm a sucker for chino.
Yeah, I still am. That's my favorite glaze of all times. So Julie,
That's chino. In the
okay.
So beautiful.
and there's all kinds of chino. You can actually make chino, a blue chino.
Yeah.
Right. It's amazing. So let's see what else. So and then from there we met at the Potter's Guild, and you've been with me since I opened.
Yeah. Over there.
Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
at her
Yeah.
place.
Yeah.
So, an interesting thing. So, I have several Potter girlfriends that I travel with, and one of them is in her 70s, and she's been a teacher for like 50 years. And she got our newsletter this last week, when it went out, and she called me crying. She's a crier. She cries when she's laughing. She cries when she's sad. She cries, all the time. And I'm like, "What's going on, Vicki?" And she says, "The artist statement that Julie has written, it just makes me cry. It's wonderful." And she says, "Can I share it with my students? Do you have to call her and ask permission?" I said, "Well, it's on her website, so it's a public document, so no, you don't have to." So I'm going to start with just reading that. Okay, so Julie's statement says, "The life, beauty, and personality of a ceramic vessel emerges gradually from within. Through the use of a handmade object, the senses are awakened and everyday rituals are transformed into aesthetic experiences. The simplicity of a fluid form initiates reflection amidst a busy world, while subtle detail and a rich expansive surface encourages observation of one's environment beyond the symmetrical rim. If successfully executed, expression, aspiration, craftsmanship, and honesty are revealed, and the pot beckons for use again and again." And as a potter, that's what we want. We want somebody to pick up a piece and we want to go, "Oh, I want to use this every single morning." And so that's what made Vicki cry. Thank you for joining us tonight. Julie is a potter in the Kalamazoo area. She teaches at Kalamazoo Institute of Art, manages their wood kiln. And people ask every once in a while, is it kiln? Is it kill? And it kind of just depends on where you are in the country and kind of who taught you and talks to you. And
Whether you're pacifist. I
Oh,
never
is that what
used
it is?
the word kill.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
it sounded bad.
All right. Okay.
Plus, I had a really funny experience one time when I went to graduate school in Missoula, Montana, and the wood kiln was out on the forestry, School of Forestry's land. And so we were firing one night, and this group of forestry students came over and were giving us a hard time. A bunch of artists, and the one guy comes up, "You got a license to kill?" And we were like, so I've never said that word.
Okay. So now
I didn't know it was
that.
regional, though.
Yeah, I think it is too. Yeah. All right. So looking over the last 30 years, because I think you've been making pots probably 30 years.
Well, first pots I made were in high school.
Okay. So more.
Yeah, about 1980.
Okay. All right. Did you feel like you always got support from your family and friends?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you,
That's
Phil.
awesome. Yeah.
Acknowledgement. My sister's a painter.
Oh,
She was
okay.
watercolor.
Right.
And so I was the little sister that always wanted to be like big sister. My mom had me in piano lessons early on, and I hated it. I couldn't practice, and plus I couldn't be like my brother. So she put me in art classes. So she nurtured that from grade school.
Oh,
And so all through high school, college, they were totally supportive.
Okay.
And, when I went to graduate school, it was also, yes, you're being practical. You're going to get a master's degree in studio art. So, yeah, they've been supportive. And
Nice.
they're still my biggest patrons.
Right.
So.
So if you could start over, would you have chosen a different path in your art career? For instance, would you have gone about it maybe in a slightly different way?
I don't think so.
Well, you're lucky.
No, I really don't think so, because I think the times change around you more, and you think about the way pots are selling now. Everything's selling online, and so I think it's more that the world has changed around me, and I have to adapt to it versus should I have taken a different path. So,
Okay.
yeah.
Can you remember an aha moment that shifted your work?
A few. I was a design major in college, and I had come back. I had spent my sophomore year in college in Europe, and I think this whole group will understand what it was like in the Reagan administration. And I was over there and seeing things from a different perspective.
Okay.
And here I was, this 18-year-old kid with big eyes and saying, what do I want to do? So that was an aha moment when I came back, because all of a sudden I was sitting behind a drafting table. It's like, this isn't great. And my pottery instructor at the time, he's put his arm around me and said, I'll take care of you. So we changed all my classes, and when I look back at that, and I say, I'm living my dream, because I knew at that time I wanted a studio in the country, I wanted to make pots, and that's what I'm doing now. So, and that's like that whole thing of, would you take a different course? It's like, that part of it, I don't want to change. I love that. I think as far as my work, an aha moment was doing a workshop with Don Wrights.
Oh my gosh.
And Don he taught at University of Wisconsin for years, and he was just this ball of energy, and he came and did a workshop. And his whole idea about just letting clay be clay, the responsiveness of clay, and so I really took that to heart, and especially in graduate school when you're trying to find your soul there and find your way to express yourself, and have an end goal, because at the end of 3 years you have to tie this all up and display it and write about it. And so that was an aha moment. I think it really opened up a lot for me. Those were I think the big ones. So as far as my work goes.
Okay. Yeah. What do you do to keep yourself motivated and interested in your work?
Work.
Just keep working.
Work. And get excited about it. And it may only be one piece that comes out of the kiln load that you just absolutely love and you want to get back into the studio. And if anyone has ever worked in clay, people like to work at different stages of the clay process. So some people like when it dries out and you can carve it and you can get a lot of details. Some people like to put a lot of glaze on something and get a certain color and have that be. I just love wet clay. And so right after you throw, when there's still water in that clay and it just has that shimmer, it's just beautiful. And so that's why, and when I wood fire, that's the part of the process I'm trying to keep and retain. That's why I don't use a lot of glaze. And we talk about wood firing, which I can go into the whole thing of wood firing, but wood firing is called an atmospheric process. So you're really relying on the kiln, the atmosphere in the kiln, to glaze your pieces.
Right.
And so that whole idea that you take a raw piece of clay, put it in the kiln, and allow the kiln to finish it for you. So that's what I really love about that part of the process.
Okay.
And then, you set deadlines for yourself. That's that whole motivation thing too, which is sort of exterior,
Yeah.
I got a show coming up, I've got to look, so there's always
And
that.
plus you have a family and you got kids and you
Yeah.
yeah. So the friend of mine that I mentioned from Seattle, I asked her if she had any questions for you.
Okay.
And she said, this is the gal that cries, and she says, how do you choose whether or not to mark a piece?
To mark a piece?
Yeah.
Make a piece?
Nope.
Mark.
Because let me give you a reference. So her work is really quite busy.
Mm-hmm.
And so she looks at your work and she loves it and she has several pieces and she wants to know what,
And sometimes there's just a single line.
Right.
Right. I don't know.
Okay.
If I can really answer that, because, well, like just before I came, 3 hours ago, I was in the studio and I had some square bowls, sort of like this one, and just putting that single line on
Okay.
in each of those corners to sort of set up where are these corners and to draw you into realizing that it's a very soft square shape. So
it's
that
design
was
decisions.
it is a design decision, I guess, yeah. But it has to be subtle. There's that balance between something being overworked and underworked. And even when you work simple like I do, it's still that whole idea, am I doing enough? You put that first mark on, and you have to pause and say, does it need a second mark?
Right.
Does it need another place of relationship
Right.
in that pot? Well, this is Potter talk now, where
Right.
you always talk about relationship. And if you do something here, you have to do something here. That's
Right.
just the way Cyndi and I think, and
Yep.
any other potters that are here. That's
Yep.
the way we think. That's the way we decorate. That's the way we, wear jewelry. Whatever we do, we
Right.
think that way.
Yep, that's true.
So I think, that's, as far as mark making, I think that's where it comes from. I think there's times I'm too timid. I feel, I want to be a minimalist, and there was one day, this is kind of off subject, the difference between being a minimalist, what kind of contrast could I set up here? Because I don't have anything really busy, but I was standing out on the pier in South Haven, and I was thinking about, just the idea that part of me wants these really smooth surfaces, and part of me wants surfaces like this. And I'm standing there looking at the lake going, I love the lake when it's dead calm, and I love a storm. And it doesn't have to be, I don't have to be that all the time, but I can be different parts of it at
Okay.
different times. And I'm okay with that.
Okay.
I've gone through it enough, and so I'm okay with that. I don't have to be everything to everybody, and I don't have to be making these bold statements and tearing up the clay or anything like that if I
Okay.
don't want to. So,
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
So I woke up at 6 this morning, and I was thinking, okay, so what am I going to ask? What are we going to talk about? And then I called another friend. Actually, I texted him, and he's in Canada. And he's like, what do you want? It's like 8 in the morning. and I said, well, I want to talk to you. And we're texting. And he's like, well, I'm on a tractor. And I'm like, you're texting and you're on a tractor? He's like, yes. And I said, well, when can I talk to you? Noon. All right, I'll call you at noon. So he's up in Ontario, and he and I have a mutual friend that's very special to us. And he is taught all over the world. He also fires wood kilns. And so I sent him images of Julie's work. He's never met Julie. And so he said, I really like Julie's pots. And what resonates with him is that she thinks about her forms and how the ash within a wood kiln is going to hit the pot. So, for instance, he really liked...
We were talking about these.
Yeah.
Yes, well, I'm going to pull that one out
Right,
too. But
right.
so her pots have curve on them. See how they're just a simple bowl. But by doing it, the ash that hits, the ash is causing these, like this drip, and it catches on the little belly. And so only in a wood kiln would that happen. It doesn't happen in a reduction kiln. There is no ash flying around.
This is
And, like,
another
that's a good
example.
example.
And this, just the foot, the way I've developed the foot on this, that this little ledge here that I know that if ash comes flowing down, it's going to catch there and cool. So you'll see that on some other, the flower vases, the 2 and 3 opening flower vases. Those have that little edge too. And that's the thing, is that ash falls in 2 different ways. It's either going to hit broadside, or during the early parts of the fire, we call it precipitous, where it's raining soft ash. So you have to think about those surfaces, because it's going to hit the shoulder of a piece different than it's going to hit the vertical side of a piece as well.
Right.
So, and I always say that you are in collaboration with the kiln.
Right.
When you fire a wood kiln, you are, and yeah, there's that sacrifice. Everyone wants to get dramatic about it and say, I'm giving him up to the kiln god. You know, it's not really that, then you don't know what you're doing, or, take my class and I'll explain all this to you.
So Tony also wanted me to actually pull out this piece. And what he asked was, why does Julie always use shells? So in a wood kiln, they have to have, like, we call it wadding, or they use shells to hold a piece off of the kiln shelf so it doesn't adhere to the shelf while it's being
So you
fired.
see the bottom of that. This was sitting on all these little balls of clay.
So this vase, if you look at this, she actually fired it like this in the kiln.
So that's why the drips
So-
are in here. And then
The drips then run down it, and if it hadn't been sitting like this, then it would have been like going like this. But now you've got like these fingers. And so his question to her is, why the shells? Because he uses only wadding. He doesn't do that with his pots. He fires entirely differently. He makes entirely different work. So,
and I don't always. I have to admit that because, you know, even like this has one shell on it, but just even this little, and I'm trying to think what else I might have up in the front that has wadding marks on it. The wadding, again, going back to design element, that wadding is a design element. It's a way to create a mark, a dot, a circle, whatever it is, so you incorporate that. So there's an example of it not being. Shells are a lot easier to get off. True. That was sitting in the very front of the kiln, and that had logs thrown within 10 inches of it for 4 days. So I knew that it was going to get a lot of ash, and I knew the cleanup was going to be a little bit easier if I had it on shells. So what happens with the shells during the firing is the calcium doesn't melt out. The calcium actually stays. And when I pull that out, there's still just, you'll see the white, and it's like chalk. And then I put it in a bucket of water for 24 hours, and all that white just flakes off and washes off. So then you're left, so that shell actually acts like a mold and reacts with the ash, and that's what stays. And it can be very subtle, like this, and that just had these little tiny scallop shells in it. So again, I guess it goes back to design, and I do, we're in Grand Haven. People like shells. They're
That's
near
true,
the
we do.
beach.
Even though we're a
so-
freshwater ocean.
So, yeah, and so it does have that connection to that literal connection that you can grasp onto. This, by the way, was fired upside down also. So you can see there's ash all over the back of this, and that's where these drips are coming from too, which I made with that in mind. We talked about how do you load things in the kiln and design ahead of time knowing that that's how they're going to be fired. So these were made with that in mind, that drip would collect right on that point. So I don't always do shells. I think about, I've had some really beautiful platters come out that are just wads. A lot does depend on if it's going to get fired upside down where it's a little more protected or whether it's fired on its side. So yeah, that was just a total, I don't want to say a fluke, but just that they came out so well.
Yeah.
And then just this little kiss right here.
Yes.
Just was sheltered enough. So, and then there wasn't anything necessarily sitting on top of that, but again, I was using the wadding as a design element. So,
Okay.
you guys understand technically? I was talking to a few of you about the kiln itself. So these are the Japanese, Korean style kilns, and instead of using electricity or gas or oil to fuel the kiln, you use wood. And this type of kiln, it has no baffles, and all that coal bed and everything, all that ash is falling right on the pots. And that's what's giving everything color. So there's very little glaze. That whole shelf, there's
That's all ash.
that's all ash. I'm looking at that vase in the back with the 3 yellow flowers is the only one with glaze up on the top.
Right.
Everything else, all that color is just coming from being in the kiln for 4 days. So, there's other kilns that you can fire in 8 hours, but you're stoking toothpicks or lath, and all you want is heat to melt your glazes. But this is a whole different process, and it does come from the Koreans took the technology to Japan, and that was when the elevation of the tea bowl and the tea ceremony came out of that, and just the appreciation. And all art is a rebellion of previous art, and so they were rebelling against the idea of perfect Chinese vases. And so all of a sudden it was about nature and it was about irregularity, and that's what you got from wood fire. So, so that part of the process, where did I start here? It's about
Well, we're
the wood
talking about
firing
shells,
process.
using shells and...
Right, and that was very
design.
traditional, you know,
Okay.
just using the shells, so.
Okay.
yeah.
All right, so who's up for being blindfolded to do something? Nobody? Nobody? Leanne is.
Another sip of wine.
And we won't do anything horrible. Not mean.
So Julie,
This is what happens when you call a guy on a tractor. 8 o'clock in the morning, this is what you get, just so you know. Yeah.
so when you put
Do I
these
stand
in,
the kill?
No, you can
Because of the
just
ash,
don't- you can't-
actually
you can't
know
see though,
exactly
right?
what it's
No,
gonna
you
look
won't
like.
cheat.
I mean, you have
No, I
an
won't.
idea.
I know
There's a
you
lot
won't.
of variables.
so you can sit down. It's
My
okay.
first
There's your
decision is clay body, and these are, because of the way we fire, I fire a lot of white clay. And it's not quite porcelain, it's a little bit dirtier than that, I call it a white stoneware. I don't think I have any
sure why, I
like
mean,
iron-bearing stoneware in here. That's
all
one
lazy.
variable. Where you put it in the kiln is a variable.
Turn off the lights and let me
How
find out
long
who
the
they are.
firing is a variable. So I've learned to control a few of those things.
Okay.
And again, I teach this. So, you know, I'm trying to get everyone to get 90% success rate out of the kiln. So you kind of narrow down those variables and say, what can you control? But I can't duplicate. You know, this is a pretty nice
yes.
set.
Yeah.
You know, they're not exactly the same, but that's about as close you get is to duplication. And the other thing is, you know, you're looking at pots from not only one of 800 in a kiln that's 20 feet long and 8 feet wide, but some of these pots came out of different firings. Our spring fire, we fire twice a year. Our spring firing is always different. There's moisture in the ground. The wood burns differently. So we always get what we call as more reduction. So it's a little smokier. So a lot of those darker pots are coming out of that type of a fire.
That's going to vary. Whether
That's
it's
going to
a
vary
gray
too.
Or a brown. or a blue,
well, the
or-
blues especially are coming out of like the coal bed areas. Again,
Pieces up front that are more the gray base.
yeah.
oh,
Those
those
are
on the other-
different firings.
Yes, those are totally different firings.
We're not talking about those
Yeah.
tonight.
Oh!
So, all right,
I'm gonna let her-
Leanne's being really patient. So I'm going to put a pot in your hands. And what I want you to do is I want you to feel it, and I want you to try to tell me what it feels like, what
Oh.
you're noticing with your fingers.
Oh, ripples, like you would imagine ripples on water. It's heavy. We have a rim on the bottom. So I'm thinking, this is me, I'm thinking moon, full moon. I'm thinking ripples on water. Inside smooth. Smooth like a clear sky, but I don't feel stars. A rim. It's thin. I guess that's it. Ripples. I'm thinking ripples on water. Like something dropped into the water and
So,
created.
do you want to see it now? What you're
Sure.
holding? Here, let me undo it. Oh, I totally messed you up.
Oh.
I didn't see this one.
Sand. Maybe grooves in sand. I still like this.
Yeah.
That's beautiful.
So, two things along that line. One, going back to the Japanese tea bowl.
Yeah.
If you've ever been in a tea ceremony, the whole idea is that you are holding that and you're rotating it. And so it changes. And that's where the asymmetry comes into play. And so I think about that with those pieces, or even just simple ones like this, where all of a sudden you have this little spot. Oh, there's a variation in here. And so I really appreciate that. Again, going back to being potters. And one of the things when I was first together with my husband, and he would really get mad at me when we'd be walking along, and I would just go along and feel every bush
Oh,
and
yeah.
feel every fence, and
Yeah.
we're touchy people.
Right.
Potters are, and so
Tactile.
it is, and it drives us crazy when we go in not a gallery, but a museum, and you just want to touch everything,
Right.
and the guard is standing there watching
Right.
you.
Right.
And so that's really important, and I'm glad you recognize that. So part of the reason part of the way I can enhance that is in wood firing, you have a hot side and a not so hot side. And that hot side is always glossy. And that back side might be a little bit softer. So you're getting that variation also just in the feel,
Yeah.
just from the process itself, which you don't get from my glazed water pots, which are dumped into a bucket, put on a shelf, and fired up, with gas.
Right.
So that's what always draws me back to this, and that's why I would much prefer to make this pot than the one with the handle, because all of a sudden you've detached yourself from that cup. You're not holding it in your hand anymore. So.
Once we
And even like, and then so even these little whiskey cups that have the little bits. If I don't know if anyone's ever looked at Japanese pottery, but there's 6 major kiln areas in Japan, and one of those is Shigaraki. And Shigaraki was known, and even if you go into the Art Institute in Chicago or a show, a museum, and has Shigaraki pots, you just see these pearls, these white pearls, and that's just naturally occurring feldspar in the clay in Shiga. And so that's where this is coming from. But at the same time, those are coming out of the clay, boiling out of the clay, and again, it gives your hand something to respond to. So.
I'm a potter and a visual artist, so having tactile, I want to relate it to something in nature because that's,
Yeah.
it's beautiful.
Yeah, and I've always been drawn, even in influences of two-dimensional work. I've always been influenced by that like thick acrylic paint or thick oil, where there is a buildup of surface, and so.
I'm a printmaker,
Yeah.
so it's flat, kind of.
I almost went printmaking route.
So,
It's not a stretch.
Well, it's
Not a
process
stretch.
oriented.
Yes, they
And
are.
I think that's, again, what potters, we're just used to that process. We're patient, and you wait to pull that print, and, yep.
I have a question about this bowl.
Yeah.
Okay, so this rim, can everybody see how it is varied? If you have to look at maybe on your own. So how did you make this rim?
I added it on, so
Okay.
it was thrown thin, and then I add a coil on. There's a platter sitting over on the counter too. That was done the same way. So a lot of this comes from the idea of framing it in, and I really want to set up sort of a contrast between the interior and the exterior, and this is its frame. So this is a little bit more subtle version of it. A little bit earlier, we were talking about line,
Yep.
and how important line is to me, and
that causes
that's what really guides me. But the fact that that's an asymmetrical line or an undulating line is really important to me. And I always relate it to calligraphy. That line gets thick and thin.
Yep.
And so the fact that's why I like adding it on afterwards rather than leaving that fresh rim. So that's why this is added on and becomes, you know what it's like rolling a coil. You can make pots for 35 years and you're still rolling a little bit uneven coil.
Right.
And so that's why I like that irregularity.
And I pointed this out to Sarah so she knew it.
Yeah.
So this pot was also fired
Upside down, yep. And I had one little wad there. I don't know how that got it, but maybe I put it there, I don't remember.
So anybody have any questions? We kind of talked about a lot of things. Yes?
What is wadding? So the wadding, well, I had shown that one tray. Because of the amount of ash that is in the kiln during the firing, if I put this piece right on the kiln shelf, it would fuse. Because it would just become, so the wadding we use is 50% fire clay, dry fire clay that we get in bags, 50% bran.
just like
So
makes
it keeps it off the.
So it's very porous, and so these will just chip right off. Some people use other high refractory materials like alumina. That does change the mark. That's a whole other thing of the wadding itself, whether it's wet or dry when it goes on, what shape it is. Will really change that, but it elevates everything off the shelf. The other thing is if the wads are too small and it's sitting close to the shelf, I want flame to get under there. And so the more I can lift that up off the shelf, the better. And that's what's really interesting about firing things upside down, is you're actually getting flame marks under there rather than actual ash. So then the wadding like on that would have been about the size of an orange. So it was wadding. There, I propped it up on bricks, and it was sitting right in the firebox. So the wadding got back into the studio, and it's almost like the practice what you preach thing. So if I'm working on something in the studio, and then I go in to teach a class, and then I just feel like I'm able to verbalize where I'm going.
She's able to do
Has
this.
any of your students' work impacted your work? Have they given you an idea that maybe you hadn't thought of before?
I think more in the process. That's a really good question. Not so much in form. No, I've been more influenced by peers and by instructors over time. I think what you do get, though, if anyone else teaches, is just that energy. You know, and you get that they come into it with a sense of naivety and risk taking because they don't know any better, and then you get in your safe zone and you're not willing to take chances even with the process itself. How do I want to stack this? Well, let's try it. Let's try firing this piece this way. And so then it kind of frees you up. So I was telling my husband again, who's a teacher, and he said that must be really nice. I was coming out of the library at King College yesterday. I'm teaching a class there this fall, starts next week, and I ran into a student I had there 3 years ago, and she said, "Oh my gosh, your class changed my life. I went and I studied my year abroad in Strasbourg, and then I went back and I did an apprenticeship with a potter," and she was telling me all about it, and she's a filmmaker, and she's like, "I did this documentary," and I'm just, you know, so as a teacher, when someone says that to you, or when someone walks out of here and says, "I'm gonna love my cup of coffee in the morning," you know, you feel that's the gratification that you get from what you do, so that reward.
Anything else?
Of all of the stuff that you fire, how much do you throw out?
Not enough. Not that much. I mean, if it makes it into the kiln, no, I probably say, when I unload, like the wood kiln, when I unload, I get 20%, that's keeper. You know, it's getting photographed, it might get entered into a juried show, it's not going anywhere. I get a good 60% out, and then there's that other 10-20% that I either have to contemplate or work really hard to either repair or I think appreciate. So I don't, you know, unless it might sit around for a while, and there's always something to learn. If you did it, there's something to learn from it. You did it for a reason.
Right.
And so there's something to learn from it. If it's just another tea bowl that might be like another tea bowl that warped, it might get thrown out. So, yeah, I think you have.
Actually, I was gonna ask a very similar, what percentage of things are ruined in the kiln is what I was gonna ask.
Yeah, very little. I mean, we're really good about how we stack it. I mean, there are 800 pieces that go in the kiln. And so we're pretty good about trying to make sure everything, and you're, like I say, everything's on wads. You know, so the glaze that's already on the shelf from 15-20 firings is still sitting there and turns into fluid glaze.
So how
And
tall is the, you said it's.
I can stand in it.
You can stand.
Yeah, it's
Okay.
in the front. Some people compare it to whales, but I tend to say it looks more like the shape of a flame. And so it utilizes both a natural rise, so you get a natural draft out of the rise, and it utilizes a venturi effect. So it tapers at the beginning, it bellies out, and so it's a pretty high percentage. So I think the percentage drops when people have different expectations, but after, wood firing for 25, 30 years, I know what to expect, so.
Anything else? Thank you very much, appreciate it.
Thank you. And I do want to thank my husband and my daughter for being here, so. And thanks Cindy for having me after all these years.
All right. We gotta help Bob out.
We're all gonna watch this. Your next. Get up off the floor. Here's your next victim.